Today I'm going to be teaching you how object movements work in Omi. It's super simple, just select your object and you'll have several options. On the right, we have the settings for the objects and we'll come back to those later. In the center of the workspace where I clicked, several actions have appeared. The first and most obvious one is moving the object using the button. Just click on it and move your mouse, and now I can move my object anywhere on any surface. Keep in mind that the object will automatically detect the surface and position itself on top of it. For example, if I place a podium in my scene, I'll go to my library on the left. Here it is. I'll scale it up using the scale tool and then take my object and move it onto the podium. Automatically, my object will snap onto it. If I select the podium and move it, the objects on top of it will move along with it. Also, any settings I apply to the podium, since it is the base object, will apply to the objects on top of it as well. So if I scale the podium, as you can see, both objects scale together. If I rotate it, obviously both will rotate too. We'll come back to this in a moment, but first let's finish the basic controls. There's another way to move an object. I can use the arrow keys on my keyboard. See, if I press down arrow keys, the object moves automatically. It moves relative to the camera. So if I position the camera like this, pressing the up arrow will move the object backward relative to the camera. If I need to move the object faster, I can hold down the shift key while using the arrows. And as you can see, the object moves faster. So let me reset the camera and bring the object back to center. The second control option is duplication. To duplicate my object, it's super simple. Just press this button once. As you can see, the object is duplicated. There's also a little trick. If I hold down this button while moving my mouse, I can place the duplicate wherever I want. And I can do this as many times as I want. Now I'll delete them. Done. Done. Now let's move to more advanced object controls. As I mentioned before, on the right, I have all my settings. I can rotate my object on its own axis, and I can tilt it using the tilt option. It's helpful to know default values. For example, 90 degrees will lay the objects flat. It's a right angle. 45 degrees puts it halfway between. As you can see, I can adjust these values with my mouse or enter them directly using my keyboard. Next, I can pivot the object. The difference between rotating and pivoting is that pivoting happens relative to the scene. So if my object is tilted like it is now, it will rotate vertically based on the scene. Whereas if I use the rotation axis, the object will spin on its own axis. This is useful for displaying specific parts of an object like a label. The last option is levitation. Just like before, I can click and adjust the values with my mouse to make my object float or sink into the ground for a certain effect. Super useful. Quick note, if my object is levitating and I start moving it, you'll see that it automatically snaps back to the ground. That's because, as I mentioned earlier, it sticks to surfaces. If you want to keep it floating while moving it, you'll need to use the arrow keys. That way the object stays in the air. The last control I want to show you is scale. I can resize my object, making it bigger or smaller, however I like. So I'll reset everything to default values. Default values are always 0. For example, if I made my object levitate and I want it back on the ground, I set it to 0. It will automatically return to the ground, or like I mentioned earlier, I can just move it to the ground manually. Now I'll show you 2 more features and we're done. I'm going to add 2 objects to my scene, 2 candles. I'll reset the scale to 1 to keep them uniform. If I need to center my objects in my camera view, I have this button right here. If I change my camera angle and hit center, the object will snap to the middle. As you can see, it's important to remember that. Now, let's say I have multiple objects for a bundle, for example. I can select them all by holding Shift. And with this button, I can align them in a straight horizontal line, and now they're perfectly aligned. Finally, I can distribute them evenly. By clicking this button, the middle candle will be perfectly centered between the 2 outer candles. This works with as many objects as you want. And if I want to center them relative to the camera, I'm going to use this button. Oh, one last thing. This also works in workspace mode. So if I move my workspace view and redo the action, you'll see my objects adjust correctly. Important to keep in mind. All the actions available here work on any selected objects, and that's it. Now that's everything you need to know about object controls.